Welcome to Cybersecurity from Scratch, Technical Foundations, Episode 1, Basics of Attack and Defense. For this first episode, I'm going to be outlining a framework that'll define the scope of the discussion for the rest of this series. Square one is what is cybersecurity and what's the thing that we're actually trying to talk about here. We're going to expand the discussion into what are the foundational concepts, some of the basic definitions and vocabulary that we need to build our conversation. And then from there, we can talk about the roles of red teams and blue teams in the cybersecurity process. Finally, we'll then talk about the basics of the attack sequence and really go through the full anatomy of what an attacker is doing. From there, that'll set the table for later episodes where we can break down each element of that attack sequence from both an attack and defense perspective and start framing the technologies that we're going to be using in a real-world context. When we talk about the security in cybersecurity, we're really talking about three key attributes. The first of these is confidentiality, that we're keeping the secrets that we intend to keep. So this is the really obvious one that people tend to think of when they think of cybersecurity, where you don't want your secrets, your emails, your texts, etc. leaked out. And it's really important. That's a reason that people tend to think of it when they think of this topic. So if, for example, you're using a video conferencing service and it's routed through a different country that maybe isn't on the best of terms with your country, and that service happens to not encrypt the video stream, somebody could be watching that and they might pull out trade secrets or other information that could be used against you. So this is the first type of security failure, a failure of confidentiality. There's also a failure of availability, where we need to make sure that we keep resources and information accessible. This isn't necessarily a secret thing. So say, for example, you have a power grid or a 911 service. Both of those things, there's not really anything secret about what's happening, but they have to be available and ready for use. And so if you have a denial of service attack that prevents those services from operating, you've denied availability and you've compromised your security. And then finally, you have the issue of integrity, where you need to keep information and workflows uncorrupted. Again, this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with secrecy. You just need to make sure that data hasn't been changed from whatever form you need it in. A great example of this would be like an open source project where the code is out there, it's available for everyone to use. However, it is possible sometimes for people to go in and insinuate themselves into the group and submit code changes which might have a nefarious impact. And every once in a while an open source project will get malicious code injected into it, which is then used to cause other breaches later down the line. Someone can get inside another system and compromise it down the road. So with all these together, you have what's known as the C.I.A. triad. And pretty much everything in cybersecurity, when you're assessing impacts, is framed in terms of confidentiality, availability, and/or integrity. Strictly speaking, cybersecurity is establishing the security or the confidentiality, availability, and integrity of electronic systems and data. However, there's a lot of elements of this definition that might not be immediately obvious. For example, the human element is critical. People are part of your system, and those controls that you have in your system need to be oriented around the fact that people are people, and they might not behave like perfect little units that always follow procedures. Physical security is also essential, as many cyber attacks have some sort of tangible element to them. Just as an example, computers will trust USB devices that declare that they are keyboards without really validating that assumption. And so there's a whole class of attacks that can be used by exploiting this fact, where if you can get to a computer, if you can plug something in that pretends to be a keyboard, bad things can happen. There's also an increasing policy component to cybersecurity, where cyber strikes are becoming an alternative to traditional kinetic warfare. Now, this is an extreme example, but even on a smaller scale, cyber espionage is a huge part of the policy life of many corporations and countries around the world. And so the different cyber controls that are put in place have to fit holistically into a larger approach to how organizations are interacting with their peers. The key thing to understand, though, is that cybersecurity isn't just a product or a service. You don't just buy cybersecurity. It's really a holistic approach to system design, maintenance, and operation that takes all these different factors into account. The first key player we're going to talk about is the blue team. So this team is composed of the implementers and maintainers of the security controls in a system and are what we traditionally think of as, air quotes, the security team. However, we also will apply this term to the law enforcement professionals that get brought in when there's an actual attack. On the other side, we have the red team, which are the testers that get brought in to offensively probe a system and test out its security in a real hands-on approach. This can be a team that's internal to a company if they're sufficiently large, but more often it's a team of external contractors. We also have the malicious actors, who are the people who are actually trying to subvert the controls in the system, and really they're the reason we're all here. We're trying to stop them from doing bad things. And then finally, you have the end users who are just trying to use the system and go about using their workflow. Now, it's vital that everything that we're doing as either the red team or the blue team doesn't interfere with what they do, because obviously the system has to exist for a reason. However, they're also a vital part in the process because we need to make sure that they're engaged and that we're not disrupting what they're doing, as well as ensuring that they're fully educated and informed on what their roles are as part of the security process. We use the term engagement to capture the clash between attackers and defenders, either as part of a game or a test of a real system, or as a real kinetic strike. The first sort of engagement we're going to talk about is a capture the flag exercise, where you have some sort of game system or a test system set up, not with any real world intent, but just sort of a dummy example of what a system could look like that an attacker might try to get into. And then the players will attempt to breach the defenses and exfiltrate some sort of flag file that contains a hash that proves that they were able to get into the system. Usually there's multiple levels of access here, where they're supposed to get first access to a user level of privileges and then finally escalate up to administrative rights. So if you're playing Hack the Box, for example, this is an excellent example of that type of engagement where you're doing a capture the flag against a particular system. They also have much more advanced capture the flag games, often at conferences and such, where there's a whole series of systems networked together and you're trying to capture flags from different ones. It's really fun. Now, for a penetration test, this is where a company has been brought in to assess and probe the elements of a system. Now, usually this is an external entity, but if you have a sufficiently large company, that company might have an internal team that provides this function regularly. The focus here is on testing the technical controls of the system, so testing to make sure that all the patches are up to date and all the configurations are in a way that doesn't allow the attackers to get in. The Offensive Security Certified Professional exam is designed to test someone's ability to perform a penetration test and is sort of a de facto standard worldwide. However, even if you're not looking to get into penetration testing, it's still a really excellent tool to have in your toolkit. Personally, I'm not a red teamer. I've never done a penetration test. However, the knowledge I gained from earning that certification has been absolutely invaluable in the rest of my job and everything, so can't recommend it enough. Now, if we're going a step beyond a penetration test, there's what's known as a red team engagement, where you're actually trying to simulate a dedicated persistent threat. In this case, you're bringing in a team who's going to scope out a target and essentially act like a real-world actor to the greatest extent possible as they attempt to break into a system. And here you're using attacks against the humans and the controls as well as the basics of the system. So in a penetration test, for example, you're trying to figure out if your system is misconfigured so that someone can just walk up to it and essentially find a loophole. Whereas with a red team engagement, you can go beyond that level and see if your policies and procedures are weak in a way that would allow someone to succumb to a phishing email or whatnot. And then once you have that phishing attack, what's the worst an attacker can do? And how can they move around the network? How can they do bad things once they're inside? And so the attack really goes beyond just seeing what the weaknesses on a technical level are, but organizationally, how can access be compromised and leveraged to do more real damage? Oftentimes with a red team engagement, you'll have what's called an assumed breach, where you just bypass all that stuff of getting into the network and just say, hey, the red team, y'all have access to this particular system, you compromised it somehow, doesn't matter how, and let's just see what the worst you can do once you're in there is. And this is a really valuable tool for helping organizations figure out how vulnerable they are, either to a rogue actor in their system or to, any kind of compromise beyond that first level. Then finally, of course, you have a real attack, which is a malicious actor compromising confidentiality, integrity, or availability in the real world. And this is sort of the ultimate engagement, as this is the thing that red teamers and blue teamers are ultimately preparing for, is to make sure that when the bad guys come, we're all ready. One of the main tools for red teamers and bad guys is malware, which is any program that produces some sort of unintended malicious function. That definition doesn't tell us very much, so we break down malware by a couple different types. The first is the worm, which is a self-replicating standalone program that usually takes some kind of weakness in a piece of software, like an operating system or an email client or whatever, and uses it to send itself all over the place, infecting new hosts and moving on without any human interaction. A lot of times when you see some news story about some particular piece of malware that took out, a large chunk of a country's power grid, or crippled a number of organizations sort of all on its own, infecting hundreds of thousands of hosts or whatever, oftentimes this is a worm, because it's something that just kind of gets out there in the world, starts doing its thing, and there's not really a way to stop it other than to patch that security hole that caused the problem in the first place. A virus is a little bit different, where you have malicious code that is infecting other software, where it's sort of piggybacking onto that software, just like a real virus, where the virus on its own can't do much, but in the presence of a cell from the organism it's attacking, it's able to replicate itself and move on. And so computer viruses are exactly the same way. Now, here you have human interaction often in the loop. You have to, click on a particular email or something like that, and then that does something to your Outlook client. The key thing, though, is that it's embedded in an existing piece of software. A Trojan is another sort of attack, and often there's overlaps between Trojans and viruses, where you have the malware pretending to be something benign, where, for example, you have an email attachment that might have something bad in it, and so you open that email attachment thinking it's just a normal accounting statement, and then suddenly your computer is infected with whatever. Of course, this is just a subset of the type of malware. There's many others, and so we'll be getting into those different types as we go through the course. Generally speaking, malware will operate in one of two ways. The first is as a remote control agent, where the malware will allow interactive control over whatever system it's infected to some remote system. Oftentimes, this will be something that's scripted, where the remote host has a whole set of instructions, and as soon as the malware reaches out, it'll grab those instructions and start doing them immediately. But then oftentimes, this will come in the form of a shell, where the malware will return basically a command line interface to the system that an attacker can simply control as though they were having direct control access to that terminal. So this sort of shell access is something that is often the goal of an engagement, either as a test engagement or a real-world engagement, because that really provides the ultimate level of interactive control for an attacker over a system. Often these remote control agents are referred to as RATs, or remote access Trojans. However, technically speaking, this name only really applies when the software or the malware is a true Trojan and pretending to be something benign before it, infects and unleashes havoc. One of the great ways to disrupt these sorts of attacks is to interrupt the command and control server. So if you can find out where the malware is getting its instructions from and shut that down, then often the authorities are able to terminate the attack. And even if the underlying virus or whatever is still active, if it can't receive instructions, it can't really hurt anybody. However, there's another class of attack where there's a pre-programmed payload where the malware simply has its instructions built in, it does whatever bad thing it's told to do, and then it moves on. And unfortunately, there's not really a command server to interrupt at that point. You have to terminate whatever mechanism allows it to keep propagating. These sorts of malware often come in a ton of different varieties. Since you can program it to do pretty much whatever you want, the bad guys can set up the payload to do, well, whatever they want. And so naturally, there's an enormous amount of variety depending on what their specific objectives are. Malware will often use an exploit to do, whatever bad thing they were intended to do. And an exploit is simply any software-based attack which takes advantage of a weakness or defect in that software. or in layman's terms, there's a bug that allows people to do bad things with the software. Just as an example, older versions of Cold Fusion had an issue with confidentiality where you could just ask the server for pretty much any file you wanted, including the ones with the passwords in it, and it would just give it to you. So suddenly you have access to the database and all sorts of other malicious things that you can get into that way. Now, from a red team perspective, red teams will take exploits and test them against the targets in their engagement. So they're actually figuring out if the real-world system they're assessing is vulnerable to the vulnerability that they think that is. And then blue teams from the other side are taking a look at the available exploits that might apply to their system baseline and figuring out if they need to reconfigure their system or apply patches or whatever. Generally speaking, if there's an exploit available, you just always patch. It's just what you do. However, sometimes the exploit is a little more subtle and you need to change your configuration. ExploitDB is a central clearinghouse for exploits. So if you're learning how to do penetration tests, this is pretty much 101 stuff for figuring out how to go to ExploitDB, figure out what exploits are available for a particular system, and then test those exploits to see if in the real-world configuration that system is vulnerable. When we talk about exploits, we usually refer to them by their CVE, or Common Vulnerability and Exposure Number. This is a global tracking of software weaknesses that comes in the form of CVE-year-a unique identifier, and then from there, you know that you're talking about the same vulnerability when you're discussing with other professionals either some exploit or some patch sequence. So exploits are used by testers and real-world bad guys to get into a system, and the thing that they get into the system is malware, is the software that actually allows them to take some level of control over their target. Now, often to facilitate this control, they'll use a framework. The framework essentially is the back-end part of the malware, which injects instructions through the malware and allows it to generate new copies of itself or move to a different system or so on and so forth. There's a bunch of different things that it can do, and we'll get into all that later. Two of the most popular frameworks are Metasploit and Cobalt Strike. The first, Metasploit, is used primarily for penetration testing. It originated as a capture the flag tool back in the day. However, the library of exploits that it had available for use grew and grew and grew, and eventually it sort of became the de facto standard for penetration testing worldwide. It's incredibly easy to use the exploits it has, as well as to add new custom exploits if you're running a test and need to test out something, but want to leverage all the functionality that Metasploit brings. Now, Cobalt Strike is a lot less focused on exploits and has a lot of facility for moving stealthily through a network once an attacker has gotten in and established that initial level of compromise. Now, you might be thinking, if attackers use exploits to get in, then, what's the point of Cobalt Strike? Why are they not really oriented around that? And in truth, a lot of attacks don't actually use exploits. A lot of them are using phishing attacks or things like that. Why do you need to find a weakness in a software to get your malware running when you can simply ask a user politely to open a file and suddenly you have access to their system? And that's the basic idea behind both Cobalt Strike and with a red team engagement, where a lot of times red team engagements aren't using exploits. In fact, it's quite common for red teamers to go years at a time without actually deploying an exploit. They're simply using social engineering attacks or finding misconfigurations or something of that nature. And Cobalt Strike really reflects that sort of mode of attack, where you're focusing less on the exploit process and more on using the level of access that you currently have to generate additional access and so on and so forth. Really, both are valid sorts of tests, red teaming and pen testing, but they're answering fundamentally different questions, and it's important not to conflate the two. For a quick taste of what Metasploit has to offer, let's take a look at Hack the Box's test box lame, which can be found at 10.10.10.3 if you have a Hack the Box subscription and want to follow along on your own. Now let's pretend that we've already done our enumeration of this box, and we know what vulnerable services are running, and we found that Samba is vulnerable to a particular exploit. So what we're going to do is tell Metasploit to use that exploit. We're going to check out our options. In this case, we need to tell it what our current IP address is, the IP address of this attacking machine, and what the IP address of the target machine is. So first the target, and then our own IP, Then we tell it to run. The first line tells us that we've started a handler on 10.10.14.7, our local host, and so we'll be accepting incoming connections. And then the command shell 1 opened lets us know that the malware was launched by Metasploit and is now running on the target host. So here we can check what permissions we're running as. We have root access. We can enumerate the file system, and we have full control. This is just a quick taste of what Metasploit is like. In later episodes, we'll be getting into how to add your own module, how to detect and use different exploits, and so on and so forth. So for now, we'll leave it at that. The attack surface is any part of the system that the red team is able to engage with. There's a strong physical component to this, where if the attacker can get access to hardware elements like workstations, network lines, IoT devices, etc., they can be able to physically disrupt them or attack them in some way that is only available with direct physical access. So you can think of this in terms of a threat to availability, where if you have a web server that someone can take a crowbar to, that's just as bad as doing a denial of service attack. From an availability perspective, the end user still can't get to it. But there's a whole classification of cybersecurity impacts to physical access. Virtual services are something that we think of most commonly. So facing the public world, you have web servers, email clients, or really any machine that has a publicly facing IP. Those are sort of step one in the attack surface, and that's something that anybody on the outside can come into contact with. However, on the inside, once an attacker has breached the perimeter, printers, LAN assets, all sorts of things like that, they can get to as well as if you have a internal threat actor, they're able to get access to all that stuff on the inside, and so that's all part of your attack surface. Now, of course, personnel are an integral part of your attack surface as well, where social engineering attacks allow someone to gain access through someone who clicked on the wrong email. But then you also have to worry about overt coercion, where sometimes people can be bribed or whatnot to hand over their access. And so a critical part of assessing your cybersecurity posture is figuring out what the worst someone can do if they either by choice or maybe not so by choice are caused to compromise their security. Just as an example of how this kind of thing can happen, there's a saying in cybersecurity where someone can apply rubber hose cryptographic analysis, where if someone has a security key, they can simply be beaten over the head with a rubber hose until they give over the password. It's not as elegant as deploying some complex solution, but it does happen, and all of this together is part of the assessment that has to be done for a security posture. All right, we got those definitions out of the way. Let's get into the real meat and talk about the different phases of an engagement. Now, note that even though I'm representing this as a straight line, in practice, this is more of an iterative process where as an attacker moves along with their workflow and they gain more and more access, they sort of loop back and repeat the different steps as they gain additional access to sort of figure out what they're working with. But I'll give some examples as I go. The first step in the process is setup. Now, for a penetration test, often this will take the form of the pen testers simply walking in the front door, going to the conference room they've been assigned to work in, and plugging in their laptops to the network. Or if they're doing an external penetration test, they might be just firing up their laptops at the remote system and preparing to do what they do. For a red team, a lot of times it's a little more complicated, where if there's a physical assessment, they might be establishing a local HQ that they can start doing their activities from. They'll start basically looking at what assets they need to effectively conduct their test, and positioning all the hardware and people that they need to effectively mimic a real-world threat actor. Now, for a real-world threat actor, unlike with a red team that might take a few weeks to do this process, a real threat actor could take years of having someone insinuate themselves into a power plant or whatever, basically getting whatever people and assets are in place to do the attack that's needed. The recon phase is where the attacker is scoped out with public information. Now, from a penetration test perspective, you're not really focusing so much on what information has been leaked. This is more of a straight-up red team activity. But the red team at this point is looking at what information is available, like what user accounts, what policies and procedures, if there's any default passwords out there, anything that can be used against the target. After, or sometimes in parallel with the reconnaissance, comes enumeration, where the attackers are making active contact with the system to map the attack surface. Now, for a penetration test, this is going to be where the attackers are launching these big, loud, noisy scans that are making direct electronic contact with all of the different services they can find. There's nothing stealthy about it. Everybody knows what's going on, but it is a very efficient way of mapping out what's going on with a particular system and what level of information is available from an outside entity or at whatever level of access is being assessed. For a red team, they usually are going for something a little bit more stealthy, where they might be manually interacting with services or using scans that are tuned to maybe not be as quick and efficient, but not throw up red flags either. And then for real red teamers that might have the luxury of time, there's all sorts of options. But the basic idea is that you're trying to map the attack service for the target. With the information gleaned from the enumeration phase, the attacker can establish a foothold. Sometimes this is sending a phishing email, which has some malware inside. Sometimes it's finding a exploit that can be deployed against the system. In one way, shape, or form, the attacker is able to gain code execution on the target, and so that's their basic foothold into the system for further attack. Once the attacker has a foothold, they'll turn to privilege escalation, or privesc, where they attempt to go from whatever level of access they have to ultimately administrative access and full control of the system. However, often this will involve several hops of going from a restricted account to a less restricted account, and then finally gaining administrative rights all the way to having the full control over the system. Persistence is where an attacker tries to take that level of access that they have and maintain it indefinitely for an extended engagement. Now, normally we think of this as happening after privilege escalation because you often need that higher level of privilege to stick around within a target and keep that level of access, but it's possible to gain access and keep it even at a lower permissions level. Just for example, you need administrative access to set up a new service that, for example, might be running a backdoor that allows you to get in whenever you want. However, it's also possible to just run user-level scripts and use those to leverage your whatever access you have. And so this is where we really start to see the process as sort of an iterative loop, where you could really establish persistence at that foothold level without ever actually getting privesc. Lateral movement can be a complicated process where once an attacker is inside a system and has a higher level of permissions and is able to start stealing credentials and whatnot, they're then able to compromise other accounts and move throughout the system. So you can have sort of a complicated situation here where an attacker is leveraging multiple different access means to move all over through a network. And that's why we tend to put it as sort of a ladder activity once they've really got a firm foothold, escalated privileges, and established persistence. However, it doesn't have to be. Sometimes the attacker can just use that basic level of access that they have and fully explore the network, move around using just that initial level of access which was compromised. From here, the red team will continue to repeat the previous steps until they're able to declare victory, where they've established whatever level of access they needed to in order to fulfill their contract, or often proven that they couldn't get the level of access that they needed as their contract stipulated. They then put the system back the way they found it, they write up a report, they brief management, and then the company goes off to figure out whatever broken things they need to fix. For the bad guys, every situation is going to be a little bit different depending on what they want. Maybe that initial level of access, some user level credentials are enough that they could steal some file and then they're done. They go home. Maybe they're fully exploring the network before they find out what they want. It really depends on what they actually want. But the key thing at this phase is that they're trying to, if they're smart anyway, clean up forensic clues that they might have left behind and otherwise prepare to exit the system and go off and do whatever evil things they plan on doing, cackling about their victory in volcanoes or something like that. I'm not actually sure how they celebrate that sort of thing, but you get the idea. A crucial part of the closeout phase for the blue team for a real-world attack is attribution. This is where you assign definitive responsibility for the breach. Cyber forensics goes way beyond the scope of this course, but I'm going to include a lot of information on best practices for data capture so that if, God forbid, a breach does happen, you'll have some of the information needed for professionals to help clean up the mess and figure out who did what. Now, in practice, this is really, really tricky in the modern cybersecurity landscape. The majority of cyber criminals do go uncaught, partially because they're really good sometimes, but often it's because people don't know what they need to retain in order to help figure out who did what. And so we'll do what we can to sort of highlight different areas where steps can be taken to capture information that might help in tracking things down after breaches happen. In the next episode, we'll talk about enumeration, mapping and managing technical attack surfaces. You might be thinking, hey, wait, what happened to setup and recon? Well, that's going to fall a little bit outside the scope of what this particular course is trying to do. Like here, we're trying to talk about just the technical controls and the technical implementation of things. And so, before we can talk about how a red team engagement works and all the different processes and technologies and all that together, let's just try to get the technology basics down first in this course. And that's really what we're trying to do. So for the next episode, we're going to talk about, first from the red team's perspective, how exposed surfaces can be mapped and how the attacker can set up for that initial access attempt. And I'm going to explain all this through the lens of a target VM where we're actually going to do that mapping phase and start figuring out what surfaces we can enumerate. On the blue team side of things, we'll look at that set of tools that the red team is using and figure out how we can manage our attack surface and frustrate those initial access attempts by hiding information that we don't necessarily need to disclose.